There is a ton of research out there that talks about the more you increase time pressure on a person, the more risk-taking they're willing to be, the looser they'll become on the heuristics of what they're willing to accept as a valid output. We also see that people's ability to accurately identify something as a false fact also decreases the more that someone feels pressure or time crunch to make a decision.
Employers and the media are pressuring us to adopt AI quickly, but over-reliance on large language models poses huge risks. Not only is GenAI highly likely to make mistakes, we're putting the entire dataset of our businesses at risk if we take AI results as immediate truth. In this episode, we discuss and debate the risks and remedies for businesses rushing to adopt AI for core workflows and services.
You as a business know what success looks like. These tools don't. You and your team, especially your frontline workers, know how to make success happen. It's probably better to have these tools modeled after the positive and successful behaviors of your team than off of some randomized training data that you'll never know what was there.
Listen to this episode to learn about the impact of time pressure on teams, on production and quality, the risks of over-reliance on technology that's frequently incorrect, the importance of focused use cases and training data, recognizing the importance of expertise and critical analysis, pinpointing how to best leverage AI to improve workflow.
If something looks plausible, and if you don't have the subject matter expertise to be able to identify when something is, let's just call it bullshit, right? You won't recognize that. And so you will let that slip through. It will become increasingly less valuable or increasingly less correct and increasingly opening companies up to risk because of that. We as organizations need to also look at ways of training employees and putting processes and stop gates in.
Today, we're trying out a new format, which we plan to include between guest episodes from time to time. This allows us to share our own experience as consultants and practitioners and to bring together learnings across multiple interviews. If you want to see more episodes like this, where we discuss amongst ourselves the topics of the day, please reach out and let us know. I'm one of the co-hosts, Brittany Hobbs. I'm VP of Insights at Huge, a global design and technology consultancy. I lead research initiatives to build the next generation of consumer and business applications for the world's biggest brands. My focus is on humanizing technology at scale, often leveraging AI to discover breakthroughs in human-computer interaction. My co-host is Arpy Dragffy. He's the founder and principal strategist at PH1 Research. He researches and maps how organizations should leverage emerging technologies to improve products and services. By combining behavioral science and service design methods with UX strategy, he won clients such as Spotify, Microsoft, Mozilla, the National Football League, and dozens more across the private and public sectors.
We're being sold again these agents as the solution to everything. But when we look at it, it seems like agents should be deployed in micro circumstances, very focused with very specific training and very clearly defined evaluation criteria.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it's transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps us if you leave reviews. Go to designof.ai to share your AI product recommendations and product ratings. And please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. You can find it at designofai.substack.com.
Hello. So today we're going to be talking about how we can over-rely on AI. And I'm steamed, pissed off at just how terrible some of these AI tools are. I am trying to do a search for a strategy document, trying to find references. And every time I start digging through the results, they're made up. I cannot verify that these things are true. I've tried using 3 different platforms and none of them are answering what I need it to do. Have you experienced this before?
Never. Yes. It's coming to light. Just some of the ways in which the bill of goods that we've been sold about what AI or LLMs can do is under-delivering, and where the risks are when it comes to over-relying on it. I think for me, I've started to find a bit of a cadence where thankfully now the deep research versions of these LLMs are becoming better at properly sourcing and allowing you to go and find the original version of what it's provided. There's also some LLMs that are specific to sourcing where it comes to like SciSpace, which is one that only looks at research documents. So it's much better at that. But generally, for me personally, I've also gotten to a point where I only use ChatGPT if I want it to make something up or if it doesn't really matter what the end result is.
So it makes me wonder, what's happening with these hundreds, if not thousands, of founders who are now plugging into these foundational models, where quite literally the CEO of Anthropic is saying he doesn't know how it comes up with its decisions, where we're starting to have critiques from all sides saying that these tools are oversold and are incapable of actually reasoning in the way that they've been sold. So what do we do? What does that mean to work when we don't know confidently if the thing that we're getting paid to use and being instructed to be used by the CEOs of all these companies like Shopify and Duolingo, these things actually decrease the quality of work, but they speed up the amount of crap work getting published?
Well, I want to take a step back though, right? We're putting a lot of blame right now on the tools themselves, but let's think about why we're over relying on them and why we're saying that, it is worth using an unvalidated or a difficult to validate output when, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that hallucinations are real, that it will make up citations, and yet companies are increasingly requiring or requesting that their employees are using these systems. And it's important for us to look at the fact that human behavior acts really similarly. There is a ton of research out there that talks about the more you increase time pressure on a person, the more risk-taking they're willing to be, the looser they'll become on the heuristics of what they're willing to accept as a valid output. We also see that people's ability to accurately identify something as a false fact also decreases the more that someone feels pressure or time crunch to make a decision. And so we're seeing the impacts on time pressure that were happening with workers in knowledge work when it came to work output. So I would almost ask, why are we then saying, hey, these tools are supposed to help that, but all they're doing is creating a technology version of the problem that we were already being faced with, rather than equipping people to make smarter, higher quality outputs. There seems to be a disconnect to me in terms of like the value that we're providing, but instead it's almost like we're just giving the technology or the tool the stress of having to make those decisions and the fault of the decisions as well, rather than addressing the actual need to have better cognitive reasoning, better time or space or quality control to be able to train people or teach people how to identify higher quality outputs and increase our expectation on those outputs.
That's a great point. Now, when we think about time is the thing that is being sold as the biggest advantage of these tools. And what is time worth if you're unsure of the quality outputs? But you're right. Let's zoom backwards. SaaS tools were built on spec quite often. They were built to solve problems that were undermining a team's ability to work through a task, perhaps to address some of those knowledge gaps that existed, to upskill them in many respects. But the difference is with a SaaS tool, you typically would know what the inputs were, and the outputs were much more predictable in many respects. A spreadsheet always did what a spreadsheet does. But now that we're asking tools to summarize a spreadsheet, to seek out data from various different platforms or databases or tables, you could ask the same query multiple times and it might give you a different response. And if you work in finance or analytics, that's not acceptable. And I know you were looking at an example earlier today of how data can degrade in these sorts of systems.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't really know what a lot of these systems are trained on. And, to this point, it's been trained on, let's call it the internet writ large, right? But then the more that we're creating AI content, it's just going to continue to degrade the actual ability to train and refine and improve the outputs. This experiment, let's call it, was one where someone ran the exact same prompt 74 times on ChatGPT. The prompt was, create the exact replica of this image. Don't change a thing. And with each new version of putting the prompt in, they would take the AI-generated image and put that in. What ended up happening is that over the course of the 74 prompts, that image changed dramatically, each time changing quite a bit, even to the point of changing the skin color of the person whose picture it was, changing the shape of their face, the position that they were sitting in. It was almost like a game of telephone, each time degrading or changing what it was enough that it seemed valid, but not actually continuing to be valid. And this tells us a couple things. One, obviously something where it needs to contain or retain the integrity. We should be really wary of using this technology for that. But two, it also just goes to show that this isn't actually taking our instructions. It's not taking the defined parameters of what we're putting in and upholding that using a database of knowledge. It's actually going and trying to then estimate or assume what the next version you're looking for will be. So it is changing it every time, even when you're asking it to stay and be upheld.
That's super interesting because if you think again about traditional software, there's a lossiness that's expected. We can talk about the facsimile effect, the photocopy effect. There's a degradation that should naturally happen as an object moves through time and space and there's friction. But what we're talking about with LLMs is that you can run a process and the outcome is so unpredictable that the system doesn't even know what to predict in such a way to evaluate its own work. And let's say if I'm in a document company or I'm in some sort of legal software, what does that mean, right? And there's a lot of vocal advocates, particularly some upcoming guests of ours, so Dr. Emily Bender and Dr. Alex Hanna, who are vocal advocates for what LLMs should be able to do, and they call them word predictors. They believe that these systems are most effective when they're trained on a specific data set with specific outcomes and specific guidelines in mind, and that the minute you come out of that, the results are fully unpredictable. Now, what that looks like in reality is like, let's say, for example, there was an experiment done by another group, so researchers from Carnegie Mellon, where they built a company fully staffed by LLM agents to see what would happen. And the results were terrible. They measured each agent individually and then cohesively as a team. And the results were so poor that they had to stop it. Some of the agents performed at like 11% task completion rate. That's unacceptable, but yet these systems are being sold as business ready. So you working at an agency, how can we sell solutions when we're not sure about the outputs? What can we do about it? How can we bolster those? How can we make sure that we're building the right thing in a human-centered and outcome-specific way?
One of the main things that we can do is, let's take, for example, we're talking about not really knowing what the training data is, right? And in this case, the biggest challenges are coming out of these large language models that are intended for multi-purpose or multi-use. And they're not really properly trained or defined within parameters that are for a specific use. So we don't know what their biases are. We don't know what kind of data it's been trained on. We don't know what the quality assurance and evaluations have been based on. So we don't know what this model even thinks success looks like. And so one of the things that we can do is, if you are then going and refining and training based on first-party data, based on, specific golden queries that are intended to look at success with a specific bias in mind, and really build it out to be biased towards whatever that brand, that product, that user, experience needs to be, then at least we can design for an experience or an output that is much more geared towards what we would expect and what will be considered successful within that particular purpose. So I think that's the biggest one, is how do we use more specific defined data and success metrics to then ensure that we're at least biasing the system towards where we want it to go, rather than creating negative bias.
And that was a big topic of discussion in episode 30, where we had Tyler Ockman on from 4 Enterprises. He spoke at length that from an SMB perspective, you don't want to be beholden to the big foundational models. You want to have the ability and the flexibility to shift from one to another. But what matters is how you unlock your first party data. And just like you described, he was saying that if you build point solutions with hyper focused goals, measurable outcomes, and trained it on exactly the data necessary to ensure those outcomes were more likely to happen, then you can actually build a sustainable product and business really on top of it. And this goes in line to a conversation we had many, many months ago with the former data alchemist from Spotify, where he was very focused on, you know what, LLMs might not be the right solution, but what does matter is you need to understand what success is. You need to break it down into measurable components. And if you can't even do that, then don't bother, because this is a guessing tool. And the more it has to guess, the more unpredictable you and your business have to deal with. This all just surrounds this toolkit that we need to arm listeners with, which is ultimately to not believe that LLMs are capable at everything. And more importantly, to believe in the providence and the knowledge of yourself and your customers. You as a business know what success looks like. These tools don't. You and your team, especially your frontline workers, know how to make success happen. It's probably better to have these tools modeled after the positive and successful behaviors of your team than off of some randomized training data that you'll never know what was there. So that seems really powerful and important. And we need to not lose sight of the meaning and the impact and the value of UX and research and such, because we've heard this repeatedly and repeatedly. Is you need to know what people want, what drives value from them. Like just before this, I was listening to a podcast with the Monday founder, and he was talking about that sometimes it's not about releasing new features, it's actually getting the ones that people want right. Because if you don't get those right, they add zero value. Doesn't matter if you release them. And these tools can be used in a retroactive way to bolster the foundation that your business is built on, but we keep forgetting the importance of research.
And I would even say there's been a lot of research in cognitive psychology that looks at people's acceptance rates of insights or outputs, let's call it, right? So people tend to accept information that looks right because they don't have the capacity or the mental load available to be able to really critique it or to push it further. And so unless we are also putting into practice this idea of, critical thinking and critical review of what we're looking at, when something looks good enough, right? Good enough is we like to say in UX, is we're often trying to overcome the sense that someone has done what they needed rather than the actual validity of what they needed to do. And so if something looks plausible, and if you don't have the subject matter expertise to be able to identify when something is, let's just call it bullshit, right? You won't recognize that. And so you will let that slip through. And so one of the biggest risks that we're seeing in organizations that are really pushing forward this idea of AI everything is what's going to happen when something is incorrect or incomplete in the correctness or the value of it. And then you're just using that and you're constantly cycling on top of it. So it will become increasingly less valuable or increasingly less correct and increasingly opening companies up to risk because of that. We as organizations need to also look at ways of training employees and putting processes and stop gates in that allow people to think critically or to bring in subject matter expertise from across the organization. For me, as a person who does lead research and who is responsible for trying to get more research happening within the agency that I work at, the biggest fear that I have is that people will assume that the tool will do the work for them and will give them the insights that they need, and they won't have to build up that muscle or that skill set to recognize that, hey, actually, that insight was incorrect based on what I heard in the interviews, or, that's actually not a very plausible product feature or product insight that we can use based on all of these other things around culture or risk tolerance of a client or of a product, right? So I think we need to start building in practices that equip our human workforce much more to be able to not just be reliant on these tools, but to effectively steer them so that they are constantly recorrecting or redirecting it. Because I don't think the tools are going away.
Yeah. So for myself, my experience is a little different because I'm a strategy consultant working usually with large enterprises or large institutions. My focus is building a business case for why workflows should change, why a business unit should launch different initiatives. And I'm constantly looking for proof. And what happens is when I use these LLMs to look for proof, it generates proof. And this is a huge red flag for me because basically I can spread misinformation like crazy and I could be misdirected and it's all my fault. I ultimately take full culpability for those errors if they do happen. And let's take, for example, today I ran the same prompt on 3 different platforms. All 3 of them gave me different responses. One of the platforms, I asked explicitly to annotate sources, and it gave me the same source, the same link for every single option in the list, which is outrageous. And then the other one, I was trying to backtrack where it got a specific quote from, and it got it from the AI summary generated by Google, where we don't even know where that came from. So it is just insanity how information is being misspread. It actually brings you to a point where you start questioning whether these solutions are able to actually solve anything, whether they're just knowledge seeking. Knowledge seeking is important because it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the answer, or whether they're better at spreading misinformation. I'm not a detractor. I'm just a little pissed off today because of how ineffective the tools are. But then I see stories like this one from Reddit where some researchers went in there and launched some AIs to spread misinformation to prove whether people could tell that they're real or not. It's outrageous. Reddit's even suing them because it's totally unethical. But we're at this point now where the solutions are better suited for creative, divergent thinking tasks where the inability to know what they are thinking and what they're going to do is the use case that they need to be leveraged for. So in this moment in time, I just wonder what's the next step. We're being sold again these agents as the solution to everything. But when we look at it, it seems like agents should be deployed in micro circumstances, very focused with very specific training and very clearly defined evaluation criteria.
Yeah, I can't really argue with that. It's going to bring up a whole new industry, honestly, in terms of identifying and mapping out how to create this agent-to-agent ecosystem that ensures that it is structured in a safe, responsible way that provides actual value rather than creating diminishing returns in terms of truthfulness and value in the output. We have to look at a couple different things. Like from a behavioral lens, we're also at this time where we're trying to create products that create real value, that are actually offloading some of the, let's call it negative work tasks that we don't want to be doing, so that we have that time freed up to do something else rather than just more of the same thing, hopefully, fingers crossed. But I think it's also really important that we're being thoughtful about how we do it, because as a behavioral scientist, one of the things that I'm seeing more and more is there's conversations about, okay, we don't want to anthropomorphize and all that. We understand that that's bad, but yet we still use terms like, how does the AI think? How is it succeeding? We assign terms about the outputs that are being created through these AI tools that are kind of diminutive in the term of they lower our threshold of what we're comfortable with from a risk tolerance of the accuracy of what we're seeing. Because if we think of these tools as thinking, it means that we don't necessarily need the end output to be hyper accurate. Because if you're thinking about something, this is what I think, there's some element of it being a personal response. It might not be accurate. It might be somewhat fallible. And so the more that we continue to market and talk about these tools as thinking or succeeding or creating, then the more that we almost give it permission to be fallible. And as we continue to allow it to be fallible, those use cases and the value that it creates will continue to be diminished or just be less powerful. Because this is a tool, it is a thing that a software that should be malleable towards an effective use case. And right now we're in this weird gray area where the use cases are diminishing when they should be growing.
Yeah, it makes me think whether these solutions are intended for knowledge seeking or whether for replacing expertise. And there's a lot of critique out there that, yeah, AI can complete tasks. And again, we spoke earlier about how the completion rate may not be as high as it should be. They will get better, they'll get smarter, or whether they can replace people. And thus far, there's no evidence they can replace people. But it will be interesting to see, and he spoke to this, that we might get to a point where there'll be an entire industry, a premium industry, where it says verified by humans. And the premium tier on your SaaS solution will say that. You will pay premium dollar to have someone verify things. And that's shocking, coming out of a world where we have really high expectations for these tools. What will it mean? And it makes me think also of Grok, the much maligned AI tool from X Twitter. I actually enjoy using it for no other reason that it captures real-time information and gives me a quick summary of what's happened. But when you use it in different contexts, it pulls in all the crazy ideas and crazy thoughts that people have about a subject. And it makes you recognize how easy it is to basically skew and poison a data set. And from a business perspective, particularly in enterprise settings, what happens if one of your tables is formatted incorrectly or values aren't attributed properly? Maybe we don't have the staff on site anymore who can actually go in and verify that. And what happens to every other data set once you reference it 3 or 4 times?
Well, I would also argue what happens to the average person's creativity and critical thinking if we're over relying on an AI to provide these summaries for us to know what we should think or how we should act. And I know that sounds like a really sort of a doomer statement, but I mean this more in the perspective of, let's take the really simple task of using an AI tool to analyze a set of interviews and then relying on that to provide your themes and your quotes and all of that. And you're not taking the time to go through any of that to validate it or review it yourself. You've gone from having someone who became trained and really good at listening for the quiet parts and identifying opportunities or needs based on the nuances of how someone spoke or the things in between what they were saying, rather than the explicit words that came out of their mouth. And so what does that do if you then have, again, in this example, a new generation of researchers who come up over relying on these tools and not building out that capacity for critically understanding a human need or translating that into, let's say, like design requirements? You're losing that artistry as well because you're over relying on these tools. And so I think there's a degradation in the data, but there's also a degradation in our ability to then participate in engaging with what's happening, what the data is that's feeding these AI systems.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it's transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us in your favorite podcasting app. It also really helps us if you leave reviews. We're on a mission to collect examples of how you're using AI to elevate how you work. Share your examples at designof.ai.
Yeah, so last week, John Maeda released his Design Tech Report 2025, and it was wonderful. Everyone should go watch it. It's full of such fun experiments, what people can do with these tools and how computationally they're evolving. I don't want to say evolving in a genetic form, but just evolving how they can complete tasks and interactions that can evolve within them. But one of our past guests was referenced in there, Sarah Gold. What's interesting about Sarah, and she was on here, you can watch the episode, she talks at length about trust, but she actually has been criticized by the UX community because at one point she wrote an article, it was wonderful a year ago, saying trust is more important than good UX. And when I think of AI, it's such a prescient thing. It doesn't matter the brand of OpenAI, it doesn't matter the brand of Google or any of these companies, right? Is if I don't trust the system, then I won't use it. I won't rely on it. I won't use it. But the other piece that's important about her frame of reference is she also has this model for looking at solutions from perspective of becoming over-reliant on them and what happens when you become over-reliant, because then you accept everything. You start eliminating skill sets from your repertoire. And for the founders and builders out there, there's a real question to be asked of yourself and your team and your customers of in what ways do they actually need to rely on this thing? What are the respectful ways to assist people? What are the disrespectful ways to not properly explain the gaps in what might be happening behind the scenes? So there's a whole new school of thought that probably needs to be explored as we move more and more into this probabilistic future.
To tie it back to some of the things that Sarah was saying as well, is her 3 pillars that she brought to the table around how do you create, sustain, and maintain and rebuild trust has to do with transparency, participation, and accountability. I think it's really important that we continue to think through those pillars as we, as people working in the space, are building out these products, because part of it is we do need to create real value, which I'm not sure that a lot of these systems are there yet, but also about transparency. Like, how do people want to engage in these systems to get value, but also how can we ensure that we are reinforcing the human expertise in using these and bringing back checks about what it is and what we're learning and how to use that information. The more that these companies that are building these systems can also be sharing what they're learning, and that researchers continue to vocalize the things that they're learning about, because there's so many nuances to this topic and the outputs of these systems that we're continuing to learn every day. And one of those being in particular, and I'm just going to mention this because it still kind of blows my brain a little bit, is, so we talked with Sarah quite a bit about transparency and how building in some of the chain of thought into a system actually slowed people down to start questioning, okay, well, where did that information come from? Where do I go for more information if I need it? Things like that. But then recently, Anthropic just came out with a research article saying that they've been testing the chain of thought in their LLM, and that even though it will say, hey, this is how I'm going about doing this research, this is where I got this information, this is the process that I went through, they actually could not replicate or prove that the chain of thought or the transparency that Claude was providing actually related to what it was doing or how it was getting that information. And the implied and somewhat explicit reasoning behind that was that from an algorithmic perspective, that is what the LLM expected you to want it to be doing. And so it told you what the expectation of how that information was coming about, not necessarily how it was working. There's also, the more that we can continue to have this dialogue about what's actually happening, how we as humans and behaviorists can continue to build and be considerate and thoughtful about building these tools, using these tools, training people on these tools, that will be vital to ensure that there's value and reciprocity in how we use them.
And that sounds all like wonderful humanistic qualities, but in a business perspective, I guess this is on full display when we look at Copilot's performance. Microsoft has received a lot of critique this week from various journalists, basically showing that the Copilot adoption is much, much lower than was expected. It's basically flatlined, and they're a little envious of ChatGPT, who actually powers Copilot. But nonetheless, only 1% of Microsoft users are using Copilot. And this points to basically exactly what you're talking about, is maybe people don't have trust or confidence in the solution. Maybe the solution isn't bringing value to people in the way they want it. So when we look at what Microsoft has been doing with Copilot, it's basically a UI layer on top of their OS. It's trying to simplify issues that probably should have been resolved within the softwares themselves. And people are probably electing to go with point solutions, and those point solutions can get the context necessary to be much more effective in very narrow set of circumstances. For Microsoft to probably overcome the ceiling that's limiting it is probably bringing in a context window that's immensely powerful, something that actually helps our lives. But equally, there's also a report that their new recall feature was starting to collect sensitive information and emails and messages and passwords. So we're at this point in time where it might not make sense to have an omnipresent AI solution yet. It may not actually be beneficial. We as users probably should be recommended to use smaller point solution products and support the small businesses rather than give full control to Sam Altman and crew. So I'm interested to see where we go from here, but it's a positive signal that people are still electing to go small, because it also gives hope to all the small builders out there.
If we want to end it on a practical, positive note, in general, we will continue to need subject matter experts. The mentorship model will continue to be incredibly vital, both from a training on these tools, how to get the most out of these tools, but also in terms of ensuring that people understand what a valuable output looks like will continue to be incredibly important. We come from a time where we feel like everyone needs to have so much impact and we need to be really addressing the bottom line of everything that we're working on. There's also some freedom and some desirability, let's call it, or power in the idea of if these tools will continue to grow, they will continue to become more effective. How do we be better operators and better guardians of the value of those outputs and better champions of high quality outputs rather than just outputs? Even through all of these conversations that we've been having and figuring out my role in the ecosystem, I oversee research in an agency. But ultimately, my job, my value is that I have the expertise to be able to guide people in asking the right questions, framing what is the right, most valuable inputs that will go into interviews, conversations, these tools, whatever that is, and marry the right format with the right type of output that we need. And then also be quality control on that output and translating that into what someone can then do next with it. There's a lot of value and power in owning the fact that I am going to get the best inputs, the most strategic, strongest inputs that then allow us to have the cleanest, most valuable outputs, and then share those with the people that need it in the way that they need it so that it will drive real change or drive better decisions that are happening from a product or a brand or a service level. My advice or my thoughts on it are that we need to start owning more of that critical expertise space and not assume that these tools will do it for us.
Yeah, and that's a perfect case study on how this should work. So from my realm, I operate from the level of trying to map out how decisions are made and how outputs are created. And the best thing that can be done right now for anyone building these products and trying to support their teams is to map out how it's happening right now, is see the variance that's happening between someone who's executing it very successfully and a situation where it's not successful. Understand what the variables are in those situations. Talk to those top performers. Find out how we could have amplified their success. Find out what were the barriers to their success. Find out what would have amplified success. That's when you can start looking at this massive computing power. Look at these solutions. Find out what are the core questions, the core tasks that would have transformed it from end to end. And then seeing if those point solutions exist. And if not, start developing them yourselves. But all of this really is an exercise in better understanding your business and not just grabbing from the stars. The value is known to your team, it's known to your customers, and it's simply an exercise in mapping that and really transforming how you do things to a new plateau, really.
Well, we have so many amazing conversations with the guests that we have, and I love learning from everybody, but it's also nice to be able to just debate some of these topics and share our own experience. If people listening appreciated and enjoyed this particular content, please let us know, because we would love to be able to have more of these conversations and just in general, more of a two-way dialogue. So please definitely find us on LinkedIn or send us messages wherever you prefer. And we just want to continue to find ways to share what we're learning and what other people are working on to empower the people who are in this space to make smarter choices to build products that will last.
If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps us if you leave reviews. Go to designof.ai to share your AI product recommendations and product ratings. And please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. You can find it at designofai.substack.com.